For 8 months between 1940 and 1941, the troops were pinned down in the shattered ruins of a strategic port, surrounded by Rommel's Afrika Korps, pummeled by German artillery, and bombed relentlessly by the Luftwaffe. They were expected to be annihilated. By all logic, they should have been wiped out. But they weren't. Instead, they fought like lions. They struck back so fiercely, German propagandists called them rats. It was supposed to be an insult, a joke about how the troops were cornered, trapped. But here's the thing, rats are survivors. They can squeeze through cracks no wider than a coin, slither up drain pipes, and drop 5 stories without breaking a bone. They refused to die, and so did the battered Australian-led garrison, trapped in one of World War II's most bomb-lashed hellscapes, a Libyan port city known as Tobruk. Instead of waiting for death, they dug in. They didn't just hold their ground, they burrowed underneath it, striking from the shadows. They scurried through trenches, stole across no man's land, and infiltrated deep into the Nazi war machine. Generals in Berlin fumed, furious that a ragged band of Australians, Brits, Poles, and Indians were holding out against a German army 7 times their number, with 7 times their armor. Join us today to learn how these soldiers frustrated Rommel's Nazis for far longer than anyone thought possible on today's episode of The Infographic Show. The British captain wiped the sweat from his eyes and peered through his binoculars at the endless sand before him. Somewhere out there, beyond the shimmering heat waves, the Italian 10th Army was digging in, bracing for the coming storm. This was North Africa, 1940, a sun-scorched chessboard, where the British 8th Army played for the highest stakes, control of the Suez Canal. If the Axis seized it, Britain's vital lifeline to India, Australia, and the oil fields of the Middle East would be severed. The entire war effort could collapse. That couldn't happen. The Italians, under Mussolini's orders, had swept east from Libya into Egypt, hoping for a quick victory, but their advance was sluggish, their supply line stretched thin. General Archibald Wavell and his British-led forces saw an opportunity. Operation Compass was the plan, a lightning-fast counteroffensive to drive the Italians back and cripple their foothold in North Africa. The 8th Army's tanks were fueled, their artillery primed. They would strike hard, encircle the Italians, and push toward Tobruk, a key port that would become the next battlefield. The captain exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he checked his rifle. Fast forward a few weeks and the Italian 10th Army wasn't retreating, it was disintegrating. British and Commonwealth forces had cracked their lines wide open, and now the desert was swallowing them whole. Convoys of battered trucks choked the narrow roads west, desperate to escape the carnage behind them. British tanks tore through the fleeing columns, their 2-pounder guns hammering steel, sending wreckage cartwheeling across the sand. The tanks were lumbering and unstoppable. Their treads crushed everything in their path, discarded rifles, shattered helmets, and the broken bodies of those who had died running. Italian officers watched in horror as entire battalions surrendered without a fight. By early January 1941, what remained of the 10th Army was cornered at Beta Fum, a last desperate stand against the inevitable. It was a massacre. In a matter of weeks, an entire army, over 130,000 men, had been wiped off the map. But the job wasn't finished. The British war machine kept rolling west, dust plumes stretching for miles as armored divisions and desert-hardened infantry pushed toward their next prize, Tobruk. The port city was a linchpin, its deep-water harbor essential for supplying Axis forces across Libya. If the British seized it, they could choke off any chance of an Italian comeback. But taking Tobruk wouldn't be easy. Its defenses were formidable. Barbed wire, minefields, concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire. The Italian garrison, still reeling from the rout, had no illusions about victory, but Mussolini had ordered them to fight to the last man. The 8th Army had momentum, but Tobruk would be no swift conquest. It would be a siege, a bloodbath, a fight where survival was a roll of the dice. And if the British took it, the battle for North Africa would change forever. Back in Berlin, Hitler paced his war room, scowling at the map of North Africa. The British had shattered the Italian 10th Army, steamrolling across Libya. Mussolini had promised an easy conquest of Egypt. Instead, his forces were in full retreat, and now the British held Tobruk. Hitler exhaled sharply, tapping his finger on the table. The British had humiliated his so-called ally and threatened his southern flank. It was time to send in the professionals. Enter General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Hitler knew him as a bold, unconventional commander who always was one step ahead of the enemy. He had crushed the French with lightning speed the year before, commanding Hitler's personal bodyguard division in the Blitzkrieg. Now he would take command of the newly formed Deutsches Afrikakorps, or DAK. His orders were to stop the British advance, stabilize the front, and retake Tobruk. But Rommel had no intention of just holding the line. He was coming to drive the British out of Africa entirely. The British felt the rumble before they heard it. The low, distant growl of engines rolling through the desert. Rommel was coming. The Allies had held the line before, but this time the stakes were higher. Tobruk was all that stood between Rommel and total control of Libya. If the port fell, the British would be forced into a desperate defense of Egypt, and the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to the empire, would be next. But if they held, they could bottle up the Afrika Korps, buying time for reinforcements. The captain crouched beside his men, sand caking the sweat on his face as he watched the final assault on Tobruk unfold. The attack had begun days earlier, with long-range desert patrols slicing deep into enemy territory, cutting supply lines and leaving the Italians hungry, thirsty, and afraid. Every night, raiding parties crept through the darkness, planting explosives and reducing Italian morale to the breaking point. Loudspeakers blasted messages in Italian, promising them if they surrendered, they were guaranteed survival. Some took the offer, others dug in and waited to die. When the final push came, it was fast, brutal, and merciless. British tanks, slow but nearly indestructible, rolled forward under a thunderous artillery barrage, shrugging off Italian shells like pebbles. Infantry surged behind them, bayonets glinting in the early morning light. As they stormed the trenches, the Italians fought, some bravely, others desperately, but their will had been shattered long before the first shot was fired. Within hours, the Union Jack flew over Tobruk's battered fortifications. The battle was won, but the war for North Africa had only just begun. The garrison was a mix of tough, battle-hardened troops, Australians, Britons, Indians, and Poles, a motley force but a deadly one. The captain now answered to Major General Leslie Morshead, the no-nonsense Australian commander who had orders to defend Tobruk at all costs. Morshead had made it clear, no surrender, no retreat. The men would fight from the trenches using every trick in the book, night raids, deception tactics, and aggressive counterattacks. Supplies would have to come by sea under constant Luftwaffe bombardment. Every shell, every bullet had to count. As the captain scanned the desert horizon, he could see the dust clouds rising. Rommel was coming fast. The siege of Tobruk was about to begin. By April 1941, Tobruk was no longer just a port city. It was a fortress, a nightmarish network of trenches, barbed wire, and gun emplacements that stretched across the arid wasteland like the ribs of some long-dead beast. The captain and his men spent their days digging, fortifying, reinforcing. Tunnels snaked beneath the ruins of the city. Bunkers were carved from solid rock, and firing positions were camouflaged with sandbags and scrap metal. Every movement above ground was watched. Every position had to be hardened against the inevitable German onslaught. General Leslie Morshead ran his garrison like a man who had seen hell and wasn't afraid to send his enemy there. He made it clear to his men, Tobruk does not surrender, ever. His defense plan turned the city into a labyrinth of crossfire zones and kill boxes.